A few years ago, a group of friends and I decided to go camping in the Olympic National Forest in Washington. The forest is massive, filled with towering trees, dense underbrush, and the kind of deep, echoing silence that only exists far from civilization. We were all experienced campers, used to the outdoors, so we weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary. But that trip ended up being one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences of my life. We arrived at our campsite late in the afternoon, after a long day of hiking. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and started a fire as the sun began to set. The forest was beautiful, and we were excited to spend a couple of days disconnected from the outside world. As the evening wore on, we made dinner, shared some stories, and eventually crawled into our tents for the night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of rustling outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just one of my friends getting up to use the bathroom, but the noise continued for several minutes. It sounded like someone, or something, was walking around our campsite, slowly and deliberately. I stayed still, listening, trying to figure out what it could be. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the footsteps sounded too heavy for that. Then, I heard it. A low, soft humming, almost like a chant. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, more distinct. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. I strained to listen, but the humming was just out of range for me to make out any words. It was eerie and didn't sound like any animal I knew of. It was human. I slowly unzipped my tent, careful not to make a sound. The fire had died down to embers, casting a dim light around the campsite. I scanned the area but didn't see anything at first. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. A dark figure was standing just at the edge of the trees, almost blending in with the shadows. It was tall, motionless, and facing our camp. My heart raced as I tried to figure out what to do. Should I wake my friends? Should I call out to the person? But something in my gut told me to stay quiet, to not draw any attention to myself. I kept watching, barely breathing, as the figure slowly backed away into the darkness, disappearing among the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening, waiting, but the humming and the figure never returned. The next morning, I told my friends what I had seen. At first, they thought I was joking or that I had imagined it in a half-asleep state. But when they saw how serious I was, they started to get uneasy too. We looked around the campsite for any signs of someone being there. Footprints, disturbed ground, but found nothing. It was as if whoever or whatever had been there left no trace. We packed up and left that day, cutting our trip short. None of us felt comfortable staying there any longer. To this day, I have no idea who or what was outside our camp that night. The Olympic National Forest is vast, and it's easy to get lost out there. Some people go in and are never seen again. The thought that someone might have been watching us, silently humming, still sends chills down my spine. Whether it was just a lost hiker or something more sinister, I'll never know. But I do know I've never felt so vulnerable in the wilderness as I did that night. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun and relaxation. A group of us, 5 friends from college, decided to go camping at Lake Lanier, a large reservoir in northern Georgia. We had all heard the stories about the lake, how it was built over an old town, how strange things sometimes happened there. But we didn't think much of it. We were just looking forward to a weekend away from work and responsibilities. We arrived at the campsite on a Friday afternoon, the sky clear and the weather perfect. The lake was beautiful, its waters calm and shimmering under the sunlight. We set up our tents near the shore, unpacked our gear, and spent the first day swimming, fishing, and exploring the nearby woods. Everything seemed perfect. That night, after cooking dinner over the campfire, we sat around telling stories and laughing, the mood light and carefree. As the night grew darker, a thick fog began to roll in off the lake, slowly creeping up to our campsite. It gave the place an eerie, almost otherworldly feel, but we didn't let it bother us. We were too focused on enjoying our time together. Around midnight, as the fire started to die down, my friend Matt suggested we take a walk along the lake. It wasn't unusual for him. Matt was always the adventurous one, never content to sit still for too long. The rest of us were tired, but Matt insisted, and eventually our friend Chris agreed to go with him. "Don't be gone too long," I called after them as they disappeared into the fog. They waved us off, their figures soon swallowed by the mist. The three of us who stayed behind, me, Sarah, and Jenny, talked for a while longer before deciding to turn in for the night. I woke up a few hours later to the sound of someone rustling outside my tent. It was still dark, and the fog was thicker than before, almost impenetrable. I unzipped the tent and found Chris standing there, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Matt's gone," he said, his voice shaking. I jumped out of the tent, the others waking up as well. "What do you mean he's gone?" Chris explained that they had been walking along the shore when Matt suddenly stopped and said he heard something in the woods. Chris hadn't heard anything, but Matt insisted on checking it out. He told Chris to wait by the water while he went to investigate. Chris waited for what felt like an eternity, calling out Matt's name, but he never came back. Eventually, Chris tried to follow, but the fog was so thick he could barely see his own feet. He got turned around, panicked, and finally found his way back to the campsite. We immediately grabbed our flashlights and started searching for Matt. We called his name over and over, our voices echoing through the fog, but there was no response. The fog distorted everything, making it hard to tell where we were or how far we had gone. The trees loomed like shadows in the mist, and the lake, usually so calm, seemed ominous and uninviting. Hours passed, and there was still no sign of Matt. Chris was beside himself with guilt, blaming himself for letting Matt go off alone. The rest of us were frantic, our minds racing with fear and worst-case scenarios. We knew we had to get help, but the idea of leaving Matt out there alone felt unbearable. At dawn, we finally made our way back to the main road and drove to the nearest ranger station. We told them everything, and a search party was organized. They combed the woods, scoured the shore, and even brought in divers to search the lake, but there was no trace of Matt. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Days turned into weeks, and still nothing. No one could explain what had happened. There were no signs of a struggle, no tracks leading away from the shore. It was like Matt had simply walked into the fog and never came out. The authorities eventually called off the search, labeling it a probable drowning, though his body was never found. But we knew better. Matt wasn't the type to wander off and get lost. And the lake, though deep, was calm that night. Something else had happened out there. Something none of us could explain. The guilt and the fear stayed with us long after we returned home. We tried to go back to our normal lives, but the memory of that night haunted us. The fog, the silence, the way Matt had just disappeared. It was something out of a nightmare, something none of us could forget. To this day, when I think back on that night, I can still hear the faint echo of our voices calling for Matt, swallowed by the mist. And I wonder what he heard in those woods, what drew him away from the shore and into the darkness. We never found out, and I'm not sure I want to know. A few years ago, my friend Greg and I decided to tackle a section of the Appalachian Trail. We were both experienced hikers, having trekked across various parts of the country, but this was our first time on the Appalachian. We chose a remote stretch in the Great Smoky Mountains. Far from the more popular routes, we were eager to experience the untouched wilderness and the solitude that comes with being far from civilization. The thrill of the unknown drew us in, and we were excited to spend 4 days immersed in nature, far from the distractions of modern life. We set off early on a crisp autumn morning, our backpacks loaded with supplies, and our spirits high. The first day was perfect. The weather was clear, the air cool and invigorating, and the forest around us alive with the vibrant colors of fall. The trail wound through dense woods, over rocky ridges, and past babbling brooks, each turn offering a new and breathtaking view. We hiked for hours, stopping only to take in the scenery or grab a quick bite. By late afternoon, we found a good spot to set up camp. We pitched our tent near a small clearing, gathered wood for a fire, and settled in as the sun dipped below the horizon. As darkness fell, the forest around us seemed to come alive. The sounds of crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and the distant hoot of an owl created a symphony of nature that was both peaceful and eerie. We sat by the fire, warming our hands, and chatting about nothing in particular, just enjoying the stillness that only the wilderness can provide. After a while, fatigue from the day's hike began to set in, and we decided to turn in for the night. It was sometime in the middle of the night when I woke up to a strange noise. It was faint at first, like a distant whisper, but enough to pull me out of my sleep. I lay still, listening intently, trying to figure out what it was. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, like a conversation happening just outside our tent. But it wasn't in English or any language I recognized. It was unsettling, like the words were being spoken in a tone meant to deceive or mislead. I nudged Greg awake, feeling a sense of unease that I couldn't quite explain. He groggily asked what was wrong, and I told him to listen. We both stayed silent, straining our ears to catch the sound. The whispering continued, circling our tent, but there were no footsteps, no rustling of leaves. Nothing to suggest that someone or something was out there. Greg, ever the rational one, said it was probably just the wind playing tricks on us. But I could see the unease in his eyes, the way he was straining to hear more, trying to convince himself that it was nothing. The wind doesn't sound like a conversation, I thought, but I didn't say it out loud. We decided to stay awake for a while, hoping the noise would stop. But it didn't. After about an hour, the whispering suddenly ceased, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The next morning, we were both on edge. Neither of us mentioned the whispering, but it hung over us like a dark cloud. We packed up our camp in silence, both eager to leave that spot behind. As we continued our hike, the atmosphere in the forest seemed to change. The woods, which had felt so welcoming the day before, now seemed oppressive, the trees towering over us like silent sentinels. The trail ahead seemed darker, as if the sunlight couldn't penetrate the thick canopy. We hiked in silence for most of the day, the uneasy feeling from the night before lingering. By late afternoon, we reached a small clearing where the trail split into 2 paths. According to our map, both would eventually lead to the same destination, but one was shorter and more direct. Greg suggested we take the shorter path, eager to reach our next campsite before dark. I hesitated, something in my gut telling me that we should stick to the main trail, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I agreed. As we started down the path, the atmosphere grew even stranger. The trees on either side were thick and gnarled, their trunks twisted and deformed, as if they had been shaped by some unnatural force. The whispering returned, this time more insistent, like it was urging us forward. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see someone or something following us, but there was nothing, just the endless, oppressive forest. About an hour into the path, Greg stopped abruptly. I nearly bumped into him, and when I looked at his face, I saw pure terror. He was staring ahead, his eyes wide with disbelief. I followed his gaze and felt my heart drop. The path just ended. There was no trail ahead, just a wall of dense trees, their branches intertwined like a barrier. It was as if the forest had swallowed the path whole. We turned around, intending to backtrack to the split. But the path behind us was gone too. The trail that we had just walked down had vanished, replaced by the same impenetrable wall of trees. Panic set in as we realized we were completely lost, trapped in this small, eerie clearing with no way to retrace our steps. Greg started calling out, shouting for help, but his voice was swallowed by the thick forest. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. We were trapped with no idea how to get out. The whispering had become deafening, swirling around us like a cacophony of voices. I felt a cold dread settle over me, the kind of fear that seeps into your bones and takes root. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The silence was so intense, it was almost suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Greg looked at me, and I could see the same fear in his eyes that I felt in my own. We stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a shadow, just at the edge of the clearing, darting between the trees. I turned to look, but it was gone. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, but the fear in Greg's eyes told me he had seen it too. We knew we had to get out of there. We started walking, picking a direction at random, hoping to find a way back to the main trail. The forest seemed to close in on us, the trees growing thicker, the underbrush more tangled and difficult to navigate. Every few steps, I would glance back, half expecting to see that shadow again, but there was nothing, just the oppressive weight of the forest and the lingering sense that we were being watched. We walked for what felt like hours, but there was no sign of the trail, no sign of anything familiar. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze of trees and darkness. The fear that had been gnawing at the edges of my mind began to take hold, and I could see it in Greg's eyes, too. We were lost, truly lost, and the forest didn't seem inclined to let us go. As the daylight began to fade, we stumbled into another clearing. This one was larger than the last, with a small, stagnant pond at its center. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the water in the pond was dark, almost black. The sight of it filled me with an inexplicable dread, like I was looking at something I wasn't supposed to see. "We need to keep moving," I said, my voice shaking. But Greg was staring at the pond, his expression blank, almost trance-like. I grabbed his arm, trying to snap him out of it, but he didn't move. He just kept staring at the pond, like it was calling to him. "Greg, we need to go," I said, louder this time. He finally tore his eyes away from the water and looked at me, but there was something in his gaze that I didn't recognize, something cold and distant. "We're not getting out of here," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Don't say that. We just need to find the trail. We'll be okay." But Greg shook his head. "There is no trail. We're not supposed to be here." I didn't know what to say. The fear and exhaustion were taking their toll, and I could feel myself starting to unravel. But I couldn't give in to it. I couldn't let myself believe that we were trapped. Not yet. I pulled Greg away from the pond, and we continued walking, though every step felt heavier than the last. The whispering had returned, softer now, almost like a lullaby, lulling us deeper into the forest. I tried to block it out, to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, but it was impossible to ignore. As night fell, the forest grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply. We were both shivering, our breath visible in the frigid air. We had no choice but to stop and set up camp, though the thought of spending another night in this place filled me with dread. We pitched the tent in a small clearing, not bothering with a fire. Neither of us wanted to draw attention to ourselves. We climbed into the tent, huddling together for warmth. The whispering outside grew louder, more insistent, but there was something different about it now. It was no longer just voices. There was a rhythm to it, a pattern that was almost hypnotic. It felt like, as night enveloped us, the temperature plunged even further. Greg and I huddled in the tent, our breath visible in the frigid air. The forest outside seemed alive with an unnatural energy, and the whispering that had haunted us throughout the day grew louder, more insistent. But this time, it wasn't just voices. There was a rhythm to the sound, a pattern that was almost hypnotic, pulling us deeper into a state of dread. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, but it wasn't just the temperature. It was something more, something that felt like it was sucking the life out of us. Greg was shaking, whether from the cold or fear, I couldn't tell, but his eyes were vacant, as if he had already given up, surrendered to whatever malevolent force was out there. I fought to stay awake, to keep my senses alert, but exhaustion was taking its toll, and the rhythmic whispering outside the tent was lulling me into a strange, uneasy sleep. My mind drifted, thoughts jumbled and incoherent. I kept seeing the pond in my mind's eye, its dark, stagnant water, and the way Greg had stared at it, as if it was calling to him. I don't know how long I was in that half-awake state, but I suddenly snapped back to full consciousness when I heard something, a faint noise, different from the whispering. It was distant, but unmistakable. It was the sound of rushing water. "Greg," I whispered, shaking him. He didn't respond at first, but after a moment, he blinked and looked at me, his expression dazed. "Do you hear that?" I asked. He frowned, listening, and then nodded slowly. The sound was getting louder, clearer, cutting through the oppressive atmosphere of the forest. "It's a river," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. "If we can find the river, we can follow it out of here." Greg seemed to snap out of his trance, his eyes regaining some of their focus. "We should go now," he said, his voice rough but determined. "We can't stay here." We packed up our gear as quickly as we could, our movements clumsy and slow from the cold and exhaustion. The whispering outside the tent seemed to grow more agitated, as if it sensed our intentions, but we ignored it, focusing on the distant sound of the river. Once we were packed, we cautiously unzipped the tent and stepped out into the night. The forest was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees. But the sound of the river was clear now, guiding us like a beacon. We moved quickly, not daring to look back at the clearing where we had camped. The whispering followed us, growing fainter as we moved further away. The forest seemed to shift around us, the trees no longer as oppressive as before, though the sense of being watched never completely left. After what felt like an eternity, we broke through the thick underbrush and stumbled onto the banks of a wide, fast-flowing river. Relief washed over me as I saw the rushing water, its sound drowning out the last remnants of the whispering. We didn't hesitate. We turned downstream, following the river's course, hoping it would lead us back to civilization. We walked for hours, the adrenaline keeping us going even as our bodies screamed for rest. The forest around us seemed less menacing now, though the memory of what we had experienced lingered in the back of our minds. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we finally saw something that made us both stop in our tracks. A wooden bridge crossing the river, and beyond it, a dirt road. We practically ran across the bridge, our exhaustion momentarily forgotten. The road was empty, but the sight of it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. We had found our way out.